test? Okay, good. Thank you. That's it. Good evening. Come in, come in. Welcome. Please come in. Come towards the front of the room if you would, please, and make your way around the outside of any of these tables and remain standing. Come on in. Welcome to the feast. Come in, everyone. Please come towards the front of the room and make your way around the outside of any of these tables and remain standing. And if you are young enough, or at least young at heart, you may want to try and sit in a little bit more authentic manner around one of these tables on the floor. You're welcome to do that too. Come in, come in. Welcome. Please come in, remain standing if you would. If you can't stand, you're welcome to sit down, of course. But please remain standing. Make your way around the outside of any of these tables. Again, if you're younger or a little bit more bendable, I recommend this table here, which is on the floor, much more authentic, and over here, the same thing. You can sit around these tables as well. And if you happen to be younger, and there's only, shall we say, more mature people left, you may want to give your seat to somebody who is more mature and come down and sit at one of the lower tables. So very good. Come in and welcome. Hey, way to go. All right, fantastic. I got an idea. Why don't you guys sit over here? Trust me, you'll like it. Yeah, oh, certainly. You can, well, if you want to stay here, you're okay. This is good. All right, fantastic. Well, good evening, everyone. Jackson, why don't you take the music down just one more little notch, please? Thank you very much. Jackson is our sound man tonight, and he is really with it. I really appreciate his hard work. My name is Jay McCarl. It's hardly a Hebrew name, as you can tell, but I'm from Cool, California, which is not a reference to the weather, by the way. It's a lot like it is here. I live in the Sierra foothills, and our town is named after a gold rush era evangelist who used to go around to the mining camps. But that's where I'm from. But I have the great privilege and honor of being able to share with you tonight what I'm sharing here in many, many places over the last, well, since 1998. It's been a very long time. And what I've learned here, and I'm going to be passing on to you, I've learned much of it going to Israel, Jordan, Turkey, and Greece, being able to dig around a little bit. No, I'm not an archaeologist, but I am a researcher. And I'm not a great original thinker, but I am a collector, and I've got a lot to be able to pour out to you tonight. What I want to do tonight, and here it is. The Bible, believe it or not, is a very easy book to understand. Now, some of you are probably thinking, yeah, what Bible are you reading? Because it's not mine. But the fact is, you have that book because God gave it to us because He wants to be understood. He doesn't want us to be confused about Him, His mind, His will, what He's doing. It's very easy. The problem is that we don't really read the Bible the way people did a couple of thousand years ago, when they couldn't really even read very well or at all. You see, they lived the Bible. They lived what in the lands of the Bible. They lived with the traditions of the Bible. And today, well, our traditions about the Bible are very different. And we read them from a modern perspective. I want to put you in the brains of somebody, a peasant, who might even be illiterate, who lived 2,000 years ago and walked with Jesus. And that's where we're going tonight. And the best way to do it that I've ever found is to take you to a feast. And that's what you get to do tonight. Now, you're not going to eat until I tell you to, because there are certain traditions about this, and I have to explain them to you because it will make sense of things in the Bible. So here we go. It's 2,000 years ago. I'm, as you can tell by the way I'm dressed, in purple and a coin around my neck. I'm a rich man, you'll see. And I live very well, and I've been listening to this young rabbi who came through my village, and he said, "You rich people, when you invite people to a feast, they can always pay you back. You invite the poor to your feast who can never pay you back, and you will have blessings in heaven." And I thought, what wisdom. Oh, it's marvelous. And more than that, I know some poor peasants. You. So I send my servant, my chief steward, to warn you that I'm going to invite you to a feast. When is it going to happen? You don't know. Neither does the steward. You just know it's going to happen. And then one day, weeks, months later, somebody comes pounding on your door and says, "Come with me." And they lead you shouting your name and telling the whole village as he's walking through it that you, sir, what is your name? Len is going to be my master's guest of honor at a great feast. Len is going to be my master's guest of honor at a great feast. And you're not embarrassed. You're having the time of your life because you've never gotten credit like that before, and you got no money, bad health, and everything else, and they're treating you like a king. And so he's leading the way, and everybody's looking at you going, "Boy, I wish I was that guy." And finally, you come to my house, and my steward steps out of the way. I hear all the fuss coming, so I know you're coming. And as you come up to my gate, which I have a large Roman compound with an atrium in the middle, the way that it would be built in those days, even by the Jews, they would build them that way often. And I would have my servants rush out to meet you, and they would pour water on your hands to make sure your hands were nice and clean, and water on your feet just to make sure you're refreshed, and then give you something cold to drink real quick. And they give you clean towels, and you wipe your hands, and they wipe your feet off. And this is not an official foot washing or anything. This is just to refresh you. Yeah. And then finally, when they're done, they turn to me, and Len, you are happy now, and the dust is washed off. And as I see you standing there, I come up to greet you, my peasant friend who is my guest of honor, in the traditional manner of that day. I say to you, "Len, how y'all doing?" No, I don't think so. It's not "Hi, how are you?" It's not "Howdy." Hi, what does that even mean? Hello. I don't know what that means, but we say it. It's polite. But you see, in those days, they had a different sort of greeting. I would say to you these words, and you would repeat them back to me in a certain manner. I'll show you in just a second, and you all get to do this. But I would say, "Peace be unto you." That's the greeting. And you would say back, "And unto you peace." It's just that simple. They say, "Nice greeting, great tradition." No, wait a second. You need to understand something about this greeting because they believed in it. See, it was a blessing. A blessing is like a prayer. You're, in essence, asking God to do something that you really couldn't possibly do because it's not in your power to really do it. Peace be unto you. Well, what kind of peace? Have a nice, quiet evening? No. The type of peace that they sought And what fit into the definition of that word in their brains was long life, good health, increase my wealth, my family, increase all my animals, give me a life free from conflict, make me fat. I mean, that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm good at that. This is Calorie Chapel, I recall. So, but that's what peace means. It's the peace of prosperity, but this is not prosperity doctrine. If you've ever heard of that, that is really bad stuff. It has nothing to do with that sort of teaching. It has to do with that which I think all of us would say, I wish that for myself. Well, this is asking God to bless the other guy with it. Peace be unto you, and you bless me back by an unto you peace, and now it's in God's hands. That's how it works. So here's what I want you to do. I would like you all to bless one another and greet one another properly. But wait a minute, you got to do it in the right language. So everybody repeat after me, peace be unto you. And if somebody says that to you, say, and unto you peace. Now let's do it the way Jesus would have done it. It sounds like this. Repeat after me. Shalom Alechem. Not bad. Must be something in Idaho because you get the in there. Very, very, very good diction. Shalom Alechem. Shalom Alechem. That's peace be unto you. And if somebody says to you, Shalom Alechem, and it's a blessing, then you say back to them, Alechem HaShalom. Alechem HaShalom. Alechem HaShalom. And so I say to you, Shalom Alechem, and you say, would you please turn to your neighbor and bless them, Shalom Alechem, Alechem HaShalom. Please do that now. Shalom Alechem. Yes, good to see you, Peter. By the way, this is a tremendous blessing because once again, what you have just done, God heard. It's in his hands now to do with it what he wants. But this is the beauty and the value of their greetings. They weren't just cliches. Oh yes, today in Israel, shalom, just peace. And it's kind of a cliche, but not that. And then of course, because of time, I'm not going to make you do a holy kiss with each other because you really don't want to do that one anyway. I know you guys. But a holy kiss was a way that Peter said, greet one another with a holy kiss twice. Paul said, greet one another with a holy kiss twice in their letters. And that's not saying, let's have a Mediterranean greeting. See, the people who greeted one another with a holy kiss was only family. It was only family that greeted with the holy kiss. And so the church, he spelled it out. The church is a family. It's not just a meeting. It's not a group. It's not a club. It's a family. And that's why we love each other and take care of each other. And so you would greet one another with a holy kiss. And you would do a gesture that would indicate you're going to sit down and talk for, well, maybe a couple of days because these people didn't have clocks back in those days. They had calendars in their head, but that was about it. And so now that we've greeted each other appropriately, which are deep and rich and meaningful and almost endless, I would invite you to come into my house. And as I escorted you in, you would kick your sandals off at the threshold of the door into my house. You never wore your shoes into a house ever. You can leave your shoes on tonight. It's okay, especially you guys around the table. It's all right. But as you come into my house, you see this beautiful feasting table unlike anything you've ever seen before as a poor peasant. And I invite you to sit down. Have a seat, everyone. Now for you on the floor here and on the floor here, you have a great task tonight. For the next hour and a half, you have to make it look like you're comfortable. So I just wanted to get ahead of you on that. Well, now that you've come into my house and we have greeted each other properly, I am now going to begin the formalities of beginning the feast. No, you can't touch the food yet. And you want to because the last time you ate was maybe a couple of days ago. That's how people ate back then, not very often. Where do you get the food back then, especially if you're really poor? So you sit down and you wait because I have to bestow on you at least, sometimes there was more, but at least 4 gifts of hospitality. And the first one I'm going to talk a lot about, the rest I'm just going to blast through real quick, if you'll forgive me on that, because we do want to get out of here before midnight and the people start bringing the kids back in the room, right? The first one that I would make sure would happen is that I would call over a servant, and he would come into the room, and he's a pretty shabby looking servant because he's my lowest servant. If you've ever heard a fellow named Gail Irwin, he likes to say the lowest, the least, the last. And I like that phrase too. We did a lot of Israel tours together, and I picked that up from him. But I have a slave. Actually, as a Jew, he's a servant, but he has sold himself into my custody until he can pay off some sort of a debt which he owes to somebody else. And so I bring this man in, and he is assigned only one task: wash feet. Now you got to understand something about washing feet. You see, you can have a foot washing service. Pastor Mike, have you ever had a foot washing service here? Okay, well, I haven't had one at my church either. There's reasons for that. I'll explain at the end because you'll agree with me on this. But you see, washing people's feet in those days, it wasn't just like, well, that's kind of neat, it's refreshing. It's absolutely essential that I do this to you. Well, Len got his feet washed outside the gate. No, you got water poured on your feet. This guy scrubs your feet. And in that environment where you're wearing open-toed sandals, if you even have them, your feet may be like elephant's feet, just leathery and calloused because of what you do. This person is assigned to come up with a pitcher, a basin, and a towel. And your feet would not be where they are now. They'd be in a different position. I'll get to that in a few minutes too, by the way. But he would wash your feet thoroughly until, to my satisfaction, they were washed. And I'm watching. And then he's going to go on to the rest of the guests around the table, and he's going to wash their feet too, one at a time. It's going to take a while. That's all right. It's 2,000 years ago. You got nothing but time. So you just wait until everybody gets it done. But you see, the problem for this poor slave being assigned this task is that it's the worst job in the world. And the foot washing servant, or in a Roman household or a Greek household, a slave, they were considered by the general population as the lowest form of human life on earth. There was no worse, lower status person in the world than a foot washing slave. None. I mean, you could think of worse things than washing feet. They couldn't do it. They could not think of anything worse. And that poor guy, he knows that in all the world, he is the one human being at the bottom rung of the ladder, along with every other foot washer. It's horrible. And the reason why is because in that world, and those of you that have traveled, you're aware of this because it's still the same thing today in probably at least 1/3 of planet Earth and the population. The bottom of your foot is considered the filthiest part of the human body. You say, well, I can think of worse places than that. No, you really shouldn't try and do that. The bottom of the feet are bad enough because in the ancient world and in so much of the modern world, even the least modern parts, we know where your feet have been. We know what you've been walking through. You've been walking through pastures and on trails where animals have been. You've been walking through in ancient times villages and towns that didn't have any infrastructure as far as drainage goes, except what went right down the middle of the street, and you can only imagine what that must be like, especially when people who are supposed to empty their bedpans outside the walls get too lazy and drop them in the street. I know that's kind of seriously ugly, but that's the truth of the matter. We know where your feet have been, and they know that the filthiest part of the human body was the bottom of your feet, and the person who had to wash them made them the lowest form of life on earth. So I have my foot washing slave come over and wash your feet, and you know who this person is. They are the lowest one in the household, and they wash your feet. If you're wondering just how bad it was with the bottom of the feet thing, if I were to, well, you know, with all the stuff going on in the Middle East, you sometimes will see pictures of Arab sheiks, Arab kings. They're sitting in big puffy chairs, and they're across from them might be a Western diplomat, man or a woman, but usually dressed in their finest. And they look very Western in their suits and ties and what have you. But have you ever noticed how awkward they look if you've ever seen one of these pictures? They just look uncomfortable. And you have to ask the question, why? Because nobody's legs or ankles are ever crossed. Their feet are flat on the floor with their knees straight out. Because to even accidentally expose the bottom of your foot to another person in that part of the world for thousands of years to this very day is a deadly insult. You do that to any important person, they'll leave the room and they'll never come back and you'll never talk with them again. You exposed your foot. You want to make somebody really, really angry. How about this one? Most of you, I can tell by looking at your faces, you're the right age. You remember when George W. Bush went out of office. Just before he left office, he went to Iraq on a special news conference that was a surprise. And he landed there with the soldiers, and he's in a large room. He's standing at the podium in a jacket that's got the presidential seal on the front like a windbreaker, and suddenly a shoe comes flying by his head. And he ducks. The Secret Service goes nuts. All the people in the Iraqi Secret Service, they go nuts. They start running towards the back of the room. Here comes another shoe. He ducks again. He starts laughing. And of course, what did America do when we saw that on the news? We laughed. What did the Iraqis do and the Arab world do when they saw that? They went, because the guy took his shoes off and he threw them at the president. And thus he exposed his shoe to the president. And the message was this: I wish you were dead and I'd kill you if I could. That's what it meant. Knowing that, we do have a few little incidents in the Bible, but one in particular. Over in John chapter 13, Judas, who has not yet left to betray Jesus, Jesus makes a comment about him during the Last Supper when he says, the one who has eaten my bread, which is very intimate and very loving, has lifted up his heel against me. In other words, on the way out the door, take that. That characterized Judas's betrayal. Judas's betrayal was not loving and it was not political. In fact, it was hateful. And that's the way the Bible characterizes it. You can see it in the context. So I wash your feet. The next thing that I would do is that I would anoint your head with oil. I would have a flask just laying around that was brought to me. It's got olive oil in it mixed with, scents of some sort. You know how Middle Eastern spices smell. It's really good because, well, frankly, you're a peasant and you haven't bathed in 2 or 3 months. So I want to make sure you smell good for the meal. And I would come up behind you and you'll like this part. I snap the cap off. I pour it all out over your head. No, there's nothing in there. It's okay. And the oil, not a little dab, I've anointed you with lots of olive oil, and it goes all over your head, down your face, into your beard, onto your clothes. Your wife says, now what am I going to do with those spots? Thank you very much. But then the best part comes. I massage it into Len's scalp. I massage his face. I massage his cheeks, his neck, his shoulders, rubbing this oil into him, and suddenly the room is filled, not with perfume. Perfume's very pungent, but this is really good smelling. And it fills the room. And he's all slicked down with oil. But that's fashionable in those days, because if you're slicked down with oil, somebody really loves you. And that is a big mark when you go home and people say, somebody really loves that guy. And besides, I said it with tongue in cheek, but it's true. People didn't smell good in those days, which is why perfume and spices were at a premium back then. But now you're filling the room with this aroma, and it all originates with you. Just as the Lord talks about, he has beautified the meat with salvation, the oil of joy, as it were. And what it is that even though, and I say this seriously, not sarcastically in any way, that I have beautified you because the room is filled with the beautiful aroma, and it all begins with you. That honors you in a huge way. And then, of course, I have other gifts of hospitality that I would give you. I would give you a cup of cold water, which in the Bible you'll see frequently happening, and there's all kinds of things I could say about that. I do have to move past that. And I would also burn a pinch of incense in my house over a little charcoal fire that's off in the corner somewhere to take an edge off the smell of my house, because we keep animals in my house. I mean, we really do. That's it's a long story on that one, but basically the animals in the wintertime kept the house warm with their body heat. And we kept them protected at night when we bring them in. You can imagine how the place must smell. Even in a peasant's house, it would be far worse. So I burn that pinch of incense to take the edge off the smell just for your honor, because you are special here. And then it's time to eat. But wait, I know you're hungry. We'll get to it in just a second. See, there's a way that they had to start the meal. And the host, me, I have to begin the meal. And I begin the meal with bread. Now, listen, these are our servants. They're leaving now. They're going to prepare for you an authentic Middle Eastern stew, and they're going to bring it back in when I tell them to do so. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to get into the content of the meat of the whole evening after the break. You'll see how it all works. But first of all, as your host, I may begin the meal. I may handle the bread. I may even handle other portions of food, but I'm not going to eat until you're full. I can look in your eyes and see your eyes bugging out. You are so full that you can't eat another bite, and then it's my turn to eat. But even as the host, a great host of a great house, it might be a rich man and you being a very poor man. There was status in those days, and it was very important to them. Class levels, which we despise in a lot of ways today, very important to them, very, very important to them. That me waiting for you to eat treats you literally like a king, and I am your servant. So that's your host, and I'm going to do that. Now, the way we start the meal is with bread. This is not unleavened bread. Oh, I know we're talking a lot about Passover tonight, and this is not exactly a Passover meal, but there are elements of it. But bread to the Jews was so important. They would always start the meal with this, nothing else. It had to begin with the bread. To the Jew, very famous Jewish scholar once said that to the Jew, bread is life. It's the very essence of our being. There's sort of a spiritual relationship with this piece of bread here. And it looked like this. This is normal pita bread, but it wasn't unlike this in the ancient times. It could look like a smaller version, slightly thicker. It could look like a crepe. Didn't matter. It was bread. But you see, the Jews reverenced bread because, first of all, if you didn't have bread, you died. This is the staple. If you go to Southeast Asia, if you don't have rice, you die. In the Middle East, if you don't have bread, you die. Because that's the most basic thing you could ever have. But more than that, bread was always intended at a Jewish meal, and especially at a Jewish feast, to remind everybody of a great spiritual truth. God's the provider, and only God. It reminds them of when God provided manna in the wilderness miraculously for the children of Israel 6 days out of 7 for 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness. He would not let them starve, so they hold the bread in high esteem. God never let us starve. We honor him today. And besides, just even being able to make one of these is a miracle. To say that here's a plant outside that God created, you can take a dead seed from that plant, grind it up, mix it with a couple of things, throw it in an oven, and have something like this, which is tasty and filling and sometimes fattening. That's what we want. They honored the bread to honor the Lord. In fact, Jesus took it to a whole other level. Very quick story. One day, Jesus is in the area of Bethsaida. He's ministering to people, he's healing them, he's touching them, he's speaking to them, he's teaching them. He goes all day. And then it's at the end of the day, everybody's hungry. And he asks Philip, who lives in Bethsaida, right where all of this is happening. There's thousands of people. Hey, where do we get bread for these guys? Philip says, you're crazy. I'm paraphrasing, as you can tell. But they don't have bread in the afternoon, and we can't get it. It's take a year to get enough bread for all these people. And he says, will you feed them? Little kid shows up with 5 loaves, 2 fish. Jesus then breaks the bread and prays for it and divvies it out. And 5,000 people, men, plus their wives and their children, you do the math, eat until, every gospel says the same thing, ate until they were all full. Why that detail? It may have been the first time in their lives any of these people ever ate until they were full. And then, after that, man, it's got to be night. It sends out the disciples with 12 baskets to fill up the baskets full of food. All the leftovers. You got to understand something. All of those peasants are hungry. Many of them are starving. There's going to be scraps out there. Do you think they're going to leave any laying around? They're going to pack them into whatever they can, their sleeves, into the folds in their robes, in their hands. They're going to, if they have a pouch, they'll shove it into the pouch until they can't carry anymore. And there were still 12 baskets full of this stuff left. It was a gigantic miracle. gigantic. To have all these people leave, taking all the scraps they could carry with them, and still 12 baskets full of scraps left. They couldn't even carry it all away. There was so much of it. Well, the people like that. So the next day, Jesus is in Capernaum. How he got there, he had to walk on water to get there, but he ends up in Capernaum, a few miles away, in the synagogue. All the people that were there the day before, and probably more, are filling the streets of Capernaum, and as many as they can cram into the synagogue, they're in there ready to hear Jesus talk, right? Nope, they're waiting for breakfast. And Jesus says, and I'm going to paraphrase again, you remember what happened yesterday. You ate until you were full and you couldn't even carry off all that was left over. Now, let me tell you the truth. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors, remember them, they ate manna in the wilderness, but they died. This is the bread that came down from heaven, that you may eat of it, not die. I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread, in other words, you came for breakfast. I got better news. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. The bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. I'm the bread of life. This is how the Jews thought about bread. This is how Jesus used it to tell them, you need me to live. That's the bottom line. So here's how the Jews would pray over the bread. First of all, I'd like you all, if you would please, to take a piece of bread and hold it in your hands reverently and with respect. If you're handing bread to the person next to you, hand it to them as if you're handing to them life itself. And hold it reverently, because the Jews would do this too. That's what it meant to them. Now, when the Jews prayed, if I were to say right now, let's pray, some of you would bow your head, close your eyes, some of you might even fold your hands. Jews never did that. You say, well, that's what we do. Yeah, because you're a Christian. They're Jews. And the way that Jesus would have prayed would be the same way every single time he prayed over a meal. We don't have one of those prayers recorded because we didn't need to. Everybody knew the same prayer. It would be like saying, let's write down the lyrics to Happy Birthday to You in case you don't know them. Everybody knows them. So it's not in the Bible, it doesn't need to be. But Jesus would have prayed the same prayer every single time. You say, well, that's not very Christian. No, it's not. It's Jewish. Okay? And they would get to the point with the prayer. In other words, if I didn't have to explain all of this, you would have been eating 15 minutes ago. So learn quick, will you? So here's the prayer that Jesus would have prayed. First of all, he would have taken the bread, and anybody in those days, but Jesus too, and held it up towards heaven. He would have raised his head up towards the Lord, and he would have left his eyes open. The Jews never closed their eyes when they prayed, ever. And they never prayed, by the way, this might catch you off guard, they never prayed silently either. They always prayed out loud. It was rare when a Jew prayed silently like Hannah, who prayed silently. They always prayed out loud. And they would look up towards heaven, and they would never, 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 never bless the food. They always blessed the Lord who gave them the food. They would say, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives us bread from the earth. Would you repeat that after me, one phrase at a time? This is the prayer that Jesus would have prayed every time he prayed over a meal. We hold the bread up towards heaven, and together we say, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who gives us bread from the earth. And that would be your prayer, except you did one thing wrong. Wrong language. Let's do it in the language Jesus would have prayed. He spoke Aramaic, but he also knew Hebrew, and the prayers were always in Hebrew. And so you hold the bread up before the Lord, and together we say, and do your best, Baruch atah, Adonai Eloheinu, Melech ha'olam, Chametz lechem, Min ha'aretz. And your amen is very simple. Tear off a bite-sized piece of bread and hold it in your right hand only. I don't care if you're left-handed, in your right hand only. Take that bite-sized piece of bread, reach around to your left, and put it in the mouth of the person to your left, just like that. Do it now. Oh, I see a lot of smiles and I hear a lot of giggling. And every biblical dinner I've ever done, the same thing, except in one place in the world, the Middle East, where they go, ooh. Because to tear off a piece of bread and to put it in anyone's mouth, we're not serving just yet. Right? But to take off a piece of bread and put it into somebody else's mouth, listen to me, is quite possibly the greatest honor you could ever bestow on another person anytime, anywhere. Because it simply means this: if I put bread in your mouth and you open your mouth and let me do it, I am sending you a nonverbal message. But the message is very clear. You are my brother, and I'd gladly die for you. I love you. I honor you. I highly esteem you. I am your friend. And in some cases, most conveniently, it also means, and I forgive you. We'll come back to that later. But to put bread in somebody else's mouth is to do just that. I dare you to do that during communion the next time you partake. It changes everybody in the room, let me tell you about that. I hope I'm not interfering with anything, Pastor Mike, so there you go. So that's how you would begin the meal. Now, here's a couple more things before we start. Everybody raise your right hand. Tonight, now with your right hand raised, just glance down at the table. What's missing? Silverware plates. Okay, everybody wiggle your fingers. There's your silverware right there. By the way, this right hand, this is the hand you're going to eat with. Everybody raise your left hand. You will not touch my food with this horrible hand. Everybody raise your right hand. This is the clean hand. This is the kosher hand. It's the reason why we shake right hands in the world. Everybody raise your left hand. You will not touch food with this horrible hand or get it anywhere near the food, because we all know where it's been doing your toilet duties in the days of no toilet paper. We all know where this hand has been. Even though it may have been ceremonially washed before the meal, that's another gift of hospitality I didn't even talk about. The fact is that you can touch baskets, you can touch cups, you can touch eggshells with your left hand, but you can't touch anything with your left hand that would go into your mouth as food. It's always with your right hand. This is why it's even a greater miracle when Jesus healed the man with the withered right hand in the synagogue at Capernaum. He said, stretch out your hand. And when he stretched out his hand, which was withered because it was broken or stroke or something else, suddenly he can move it again and he's completely restored in his health. He also restored him to his community, to his family, because before then he would have to touch the food with his left hand and nobody would eat with him, not even his family. Jesus restored him to all his relationships when he healed his right hand, it tells us, right hand. So tonight you're going to eat with which hand? And you're not going to eat with? And what if you're left-handed? You get to learn what it's like to be a right-handed person tonight. So, and if you don't, that's fine. You don't have to do it. Have the person next to you feed you, but you're not touching my food with that horrible hand. I'm not going to be so grave about it. Okay, so on your table, this is obviously a dipping meal. You have hummus on the table, which is sort of a creamy thing there. If you've never tasted it, it's ground up garbanzo beans, olive oil, garlic, a little sesame paste, very delicious. Tear off a piece of bread, dip it in it. There's no double dipping, by the way, and that's not a COVID rule. That's an ancient Middle Eastern rule. You always tore off a piece of bread, dipped it, and put it in your mouth. There was no double dipping. You have fresh vegetables. You can eat the stew with the fresh vegetables. They work like really good spoons, or you could just eat them by yourselves. You can dip them in the hummus. You have dates, you have prunes, you have dried apricots, you have raisins. They love their dried fruit. You have fresh fruit on the table. It's not a garnish. It's been washed. It's ready to eat. It's laying out on the table. You can eat the apples and the grapes and the pears, whatever else is out there. They have these. You have nuts, including almonds and walnuts, which they had in that part of the world. Pickles. They even had pickles in those days. They also had fermented fish sauce made out of fermented fish guts. We didn't put that on the table, but they would have things like that too. The hard-boiled eggs. Remember, you hold them in your left hand, you peel the shell off with your right hand, and then you eat the contents. You can touch it with both hands, it's okay. And other things for you to discover, honey on the table, salt on the table if you need salt. Dip the bread in honey, dip the nuts in the honey, make whatever mess you have to make. You're my kings and queens here tonight, and you're gonna do it with your right hand. And so at this point, we're gonna take a 10-minute break. And I'm gonna ask the servants now to come in, and they're going to serve you an authentic Middle Eastern lamb stew. And you can pick up the bowl and drink it. You can shovel it in with bread or vegetables. You can pick it up or dip the bread into it. Any way that you want to eat it, it's all yours. It's absolutely delicious. And everything else on the table, we ask you to enjoy the feast, and I'll be back with you in 10 minutes. And as we say in Israel, B'Te'avon, good eating to you. Enjoy your meal. if I could have your attention, please. Now, that doesn't mean stop eating. That means keep eating until your eyes bulge out. But what I'd like you to do, if you would be so kind, is to please give me your undivided attention at this time so that you're listening to everything that I have to say, because there's a lot that's going to come at you very, very quickly. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about this table, but before we do, this fine couple here reminded me of something that I probably should have said about the bread, that, you know, when you're holding the bread in your hand in order to break it, when you pray and you're done praying, then you need both hands to break the bread. This is typically what they would do. They would tear off a small piece like you did, or sometimes they would tear the whole thing in half. But here's the problem. What's wrong with this picture? I'm holding in my left hand. And there would be a hand washing ceremony at the beginning of any great feast that could have gone on for quite some time, for each person up to 15 minutes each, just to make sure their hands were clean, and I, your host, would wash them for you personally. And it was like a religious ceremony as well. But even though we know where your hand has been, at least in a very practical sense, it was also clean. And breaking bread was important because they also believed that it was wickedness to cut bread with a knife. So to show your reverence for God, you broke it or tore pieces off of it. That's how you showed reverence for God when you go to eat it. And so you would have to forego the tradition of don't touch food with your left hand if you're going to break bread, because you needed both hands to break it. Does that make sense? Because if it does, you know more than I do, because it doesn't make sense to me, but that's what they did. And this has been passed down for thousands of years. So now you know. Before we continue, I wanted to let you know a couple of things here. First of all, you have these little candles here on the table. They're not candles. Come up and take a quick look when everything's over if you like. You don't have to. But these are replicas, except for this one with all the designs on it here. These are exact replicas of what's called Herodian-style oil lamps, which means that they were the type of lamps that would have lit the actual Last Supper during the time of Jesus, during the era of the kings called Herod. So that's the lamps took on their name. It's a particular style of lamp. They burn olive oil. They're burning extra virgin olive oil right now. If you knock one of these over, it doesn't catch the room on fire, the lamps go out. But that's what these lamps are, and I just wanted to let you know that there's a bit of authenticity up here that maybe you didn't know. The one with the designs over here, that's Byzantine. If you don't know what that is, that means late Roman, after 313 AD, time of Constantine onwards. That one is a Byzantine lamp. And they keep digging these things up in Israel. There are millions of them out there. Last thing that I want to tell you before we continue is that years ago, I kept getting asked over and over and over again, have you written any of this stuff down? You're having a presentation tonight that's going to go about an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer than that. I just asked Pastor Mike if I could fudge it a little bit, so pray for the babysitters. But can I write this stuff down? I finally did. I put it in the form of a book. The book is called Broken Bread, Jesus, the Last Supper, and Dinner with Judas. This is it right here. It's back there. I only have about 10 of them, maybe less. And there's one with a different cover. These are revised versions. The one with the darker brown cover is not revised, but they were extras because my shipment didn't come in before I got here, and it's not expected for another couple of weeks. So I'm down to what I have. If you want one of these books, there's some limited supply there, and there's also a sign-up sheet that my wife put together, who couldn't be with us this time for this particular trip. But you can write your name on that, give your address, your mailing address, and we will send one to you when we get them in. Also, all the books back there that you can get are all donation basis only. I'm not so much concerned about the cost. Somebody says, well, if I were to give something, what should I give? Okay, $10. You know, $10 a book or whatever. But if you don't have it, you get the book. And here's my one rule that I ask you to honor, because I'm not going to enforce it. If you take a freebie, you must read it. It doesn't sit on your shelf like a trophy. And then when you're done reading it, pass it on to somebody else who will read it and pass it on as well. We have some of these books that are all over Europe because people have been doing that. So this is tonight. And my presentation tonight, hour and a half-ish long. My typical presentation is over 3 hours long. My student version is 4 to 4.5 hours long. And there's even more in here. And it's a really, really easy read. Another book, excuse me just a second, let me clear my throat. a version of this, except it's about a Galilean wedding. And some of you have seen it before. It was made into a movie called Before the Wrath. That was based on the presentation that I do. But I also wrote a book. It was originally called The Best Day of Forever, and then when they made the movie, they reprinted it called Before the Wrath, and there's a bunch of these back there. It's how Jesus used a Galilean wedding to explain his second coming for the church, his return for the church, not at Armageddon. It's different. And this thing, like I say, was made into a movie. Here's the movie. There's a whole bunch of them back there, Before the Wrath. It's a DVD. You can definitely get one of these back there too. And it went straight to the top on Amazon and stayed there for 2.5 weeks against Jumanji Frozen 2 in 1917 in #1 position. And it stayed in documentaries, all genres, all topics, all formats on Amazon for over a year. So it came out right. I'm so glad that the guy who put it together did it the way he did. So those are back there, and you're welcome to them. Again, a suggested donation of $10, but who am I to suggest if you don't have it, then take one, please. The idea is there's so much content here that just needs to get out to the church and to the world itself. So that's back there for you. So much to say. I love it. That picture right there. The Last Supper. The Last Supper was a Passover. Of course, as you know, this has been in the news a lot lately, hasn't it? We're not talking about that version of it. We're talking about this version. This is Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. It's on the chapel wall, dining hall wall at the Chapel of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, Italy. It's considered quite possibly the greatest work of art in the Western world ever. And it's in decrepit condition right now. It's really broken down. That's the best they could restore it. That's about the right size for it. That's almost life size for the painting. And once again, it's a great painting. Leonardo da Vinci was a brilliant man. The Last Supper was a Passover. Why am I saying those two things interchangeably? Though Leonardo da Vinci was a brilliant man and definitely the Renaissance man he's made out to be, he was not a theologian. This thing is so wrong, it's astonishing. Because the Last Supper being a Passover, first of all, some of you can tell me, the Passover was always supposed to take place, traditionally according to the laws of Moses, at what time of day? Somebody tell me. What time? Sundown. Look behind Jesus' head. Nice, bright blue afternoon sky. He had no idea about a Passover. Jesus is sitting in the middle of a long elevated table with all the guys on one side, just like somebody wanted to take their picture for Facebook. But they never ate that way. The Jews never ate at long or elevated tables. You folks here and here, I mean, I'm so glad you're enjoying your meal and I'm so glad you're comfortable. But you're incredibly wrong in the way you would do it. The ancients would never do it that way. And what about the tablecloth on that table? Where are you going to get one of those? At the white tablecloth store in Jerusalem? It isn't going to happen. And if you look down, especially to the right, but you can barely see it, a little bit to the left over there, it's a little bright on the wall, and that's okay. But you'll see the disciples are all wearing their sandals. Very bad manners, folks. You never wear your sandals to a meal. And on the table, of course, there are things for the Passover, allegedly, but if you really examine them very closely, you find they don't match. What were the two most important items on the table to eat at a Passover feast? Bread and, no, lamb. Lamb. Those were the things you were supposed to have. Other things were added. If you look at Moses' Passover feast versus what Jesus did at the Last Supper, you'll find there are some marked differences. Some things were added. There's nothing wrong with that as long as they got the other stuff in there. It was okay. So on the table, there's supposed to be unleavened bread. But Leonardo da Vinci didn't like unleavened bread, I don't think. So if you notice, you can even see it on there. He painted little Italian dinner rolls all over the table. And really the most terrifying thing on the table is right in front of Jesus, on his plate, well, along with everybody else, there's supposed to be lamb. And on Jesus' plate, there are eels. Fish, eels. Eels aren't even kosher. But Leonardo painted it that way. Look, he was a genius. The painting is magnificent. But it's terrible theology, and chances are every one of you in this room actually have this painting somewhere in your house. It might be in a book, it might be a plaque on a wall somewhere, but you probably have this. It's that popular. But you see, the Jews never ate the way that we do today. In fact, what they would do is that, first of all, the women always did the cooking. The men never did it. They went down to Starbucks and drank coffee and talked about politics. Not much has changed in the last 2,000 years, while the women did the cooking. And they would make a very starchy meal. It would be made mostly, we were just talking about this, mostly of lentils or beans. They had a lot of that there. They would add some vegetables to it, but they rarely ate meat because meat meant that they had to kill their animals, and their animals were their wealth. Their animals gave them wool and meat, not meat, rather, they didn't want the meat. Wool, milk, labor gave them those sorts of things, but they wouldn't kill them for meat because they just couldn't afford to kill the animals. If you were a poor peasant, you didn't have 1,000 sheep in your flock, you'd have 2 or 3 sheep. You wouldn't have very many. So you needed them to be able to sell the wool or make clothes out of it or something like that. So they would have a very starchy meal. If you lived down by the lake or the ocean, you might be able to throw some fish into it once in a while. But you were really, really poor when you did it. And the way that you ate, well, the women would get the food ready, the wife, the grandma, the girls, whatever, and then the men would come in and they would squat down in a manner like this so that they could cover the bottom of their feet. Sorry, you guys, I don't mean to insult you, but they would sit down around a cook pot, something like this, and they would take a piece of bread. I got to reach over and grab it here. And they would tear off a piece and dip it into the goo that was there, this very starchy thing, and they would eat it like that. This is how they would eat their meals. And they would just all have this common cook pot. Sometimes they would just lay down beside them, but either way, it was a very comfortable, very informal way. However, that being the case, the Jews and even the Arabs in the region, they ate the same way. That by the time of Jesus, the rabbis had instituted a whole new tradition. And the tradition was this, that once a year, every Jew was to eat one meal, man, woman, and child, was to eat one meal like a rich person. And that was the Passover. Why? Because you eat like a rich person at a Passover, you are declaring, well, they valued nothing more than their freedom. They loved their freedom. They were under Roman oppression. And they knew that God gave them the land, that God set them free from bondage in Egypt. And the Passover declared their freedom. And so they wanted to, the rabbis, the Pharisees, people like that said, eat like the rich. Because if you were rich, you were free. And if you were free, you were rich. That was their wealth. You see, that sounds like a very American idea. Where do you think we got it? We are a Judeo-Christian society. We value freedom the way that they valued freedom, except their circumstances were a lot worse than ours. And so once a year, to commemorate the freedom that God gave you by bringing you out of Egypt, which a Passover does commemorate, every detail of it, you eat like a rich man. They added that element to it. But how do you eat like a rich man? Well, it depends on the type of table you're sitting at and how you sit at that table, because the rich ate differently than the poor. They didn't squat around a cook pot and dip bread into a starchy paste. This is a rich man's table. You're looking at it right here. There is every evidence in the Bible, in the Gospels, that the Last Supper never looked anything like that, but looked almost exactly like this. The table is called a triclinium. You can see three-sided, clinium, reclining table. I'll get to that part in just a second. But this table, in the 3 sides here, it's a rich man's table. It was very low to the floor. This is an authentic height. I have rarely seen triclinium tables in person. When I traveled to the Middle East, I found a whole bunch of them in Petra. But when I finally went to a place called Miletus, where Paul met with the Ephesian elders, there's a huge gymnasium there. It's not like our gymnasiums. It's an ancient Greek gymnasium. And in there, they had little compartments for great feasts that were on stone slabs and tables that were just like this. And these were all over the empire. They're in the Middle East, all the way to Gibraltar, North Africa, up into Germany. You find them everywhere. You even find them in synagogues. But this is a rich man's table, and what made it a rich man's table was the U-shape, because it meant that all the people were around the outside, the diners, and on the inside, you had servants or slaves that came into the U and actually served you from there. That meant that if you had a table like this, you had slaves or you had servants. But in order to have servants or slaves, you had to be rich. Rich man's table. One detail.